the morning Lenora Ashcroft walked into the board meeting at Meridian Capital and didn't recognize her own signature, she told no one. She sat at the head of the table, 14 floors above Bay Street, the CN Tower visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass, gray Toronto sky pressing flat against the window, and she looked at the document her legal counsel slid across the polished oak, and the loops and angles of her own name felt foreign to her, like something she'd seen in a dream and couldn't quite hold. She signed anyway. She always did. That was 11 years ago. By the time Lenora was 43, the silence around her had become a kind of architecture. Her penthouse in Yorkville was designed for it. Clean lines, pale stone, furniture that cost more than most people's cars and was never touched. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Portia, managed her calendar with military precision. Her driver arrived at 7:15 every morning without being asked. Her board trusted her, feared her a little, and never asked how she was doing in a way that expected a real answer. What they didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Lenora hadn't been able to use her left hand properly in 3 years. It had started as a tremor. Small, embarrassing, easy to hide. She'd switched her pen to her right hand during meetings. She'd learned to keep the trembling one in her lap, or pressed flat against her thigh under the table. She wore long sleeves even in summer. She told herself it was stress, overwork, the kind of thing that resolved itself if you just pushed through. It didn't resolve. By the second year, the weakness had spread to her shoulder. By the third, she was dropping things, coffee cups, her phone, once, humiliatingly, a glass of water during a private dinner with the CFO of a company they were acquiring. She'd laughed it off. She was good at laughing things off. She'd seen 4 neurologists, 2 specialists at Mount Sinai, one man in New York whose waiting list was 18 months long and who charged $4,000 an hour. She'd had MRIs, nerve conduction studies, blood work that came back in binders. The diagnoses ranged from inconclusive to contradictory. The most recent, from a highly credentialed specialist named Dr. Hartley, who sat on Meridian's own healthcare advisory board and had been treating her for 2 years, was a degenerative nerve condition. Progressive. Manageable, he said, with the right protocol. Not curable. She had accepted this. Lenora Ashcroft was not a woman who fell apart. She adapted. She restructured. She optimized around the problem the way she'd have optimized a struggling asset. What she hadn't accounted for was the February morning when the elevator in her building was out of service, and the only person available to carry her dry cleaning order up 7 flights of stairs was a man named Warren Cole. Warren was 38, and he drove for a courier company called Swiftline that serviced most of the condo buildings in the downtown core. He'd been doing it for 4 years. Before that, he'd been a rehabilitation technician at a sports medicine clinic in Mississauga, a job he'd left when his wife walked out, and his daughter Phoebe was 18 months old, and he needed something with flexible hours and no on-call shifts. He did not look like someone with 8 years of post-secondary training and a background in orthopedic rehab. He looked like a guy who had a coffee thermos bungee corded to his cart and wore the same Swiftline jacket every day regardless of weather. He had kind eyes, and he moved fast, and he called everyone sir or ma'am out of habit, not deference. Lenora met him at the stairwell door on the 4th floor landing, coming down because she'd gotten tired of waiting. She was holding the railing with her right hand. Her left arm was tucked against her body, the way she always held it now, unconsciously, like a bird with a clipped wing. "Ms. Ashcroft?" He checked the name on the ticket. "I've got your order. Sorry about the elevator." Building management said maybe another hour. "Thank you." She reached for the garment bag with her right hand. He handed it over without fuss. She would have walked away. She almost did. But then she shifted the bag to her left arm, and her grip simply wasn't there. Her fingers didn't close properly, and the bag slid. Warren caught it before it hit the floor. He didn't make a production of it. He just caught it, the way you catch something that falls, and handed it back carefully, handle side toward her right hand this time. He looked at her left hand for exactly 1 second, not with pity, with something else, something more focused. "Have you had that looked at?" he asked. Lenora looked at him. People did not speak to her this way. Not the doorman, not her assistant, not her board members, certainly not couriers. I beg your pardon? The hand, the way you're holding your arm. He said it simply, not unkindly, like he was reading something off a page. The muscular guarding. Your left deltoid is sitting about 2 centimeters higher than your right. That's not stress posture. That's protective compensation. She stared at him. He seemed to realize half a beat too late that he had vastly overstepped. Sorry. Old habit. I used to work in sports rehab. He picked up his cart. Have a good morning. She let him go. She stood in the stairwell with her dry cleaning for a moment, and then she said, "What did you mean?" "Protective compensation." He turned back. "It means," he said carefully, "that your body's been guarding something long enough that the muscles have adapted around it. The shoulder, the holding pattern, the way the arm sits, that's not weakness from a nerve condition. Or not only that, that's a body that learned to protect an injury." He paused. "What did your doctors say the source of the nerve issue was?" "Degenerative." She said it flatly. "Progressive." Something shifted in his face. Not doubt exactly. More like a question forming. "Was it ever localized?" he asked. Like, did anyone pinpoint where in the chain it originated? Cervical spine, thoracic? C5 to C7 region, originally, she said, before she could stop herself. He was quiet for a moment. "And the treatment protocol? Is it primarily pharmaceutical?" "Yes." "With any manual work?" "Traction, specific mobilization. Some not consistently." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his card again. "I'm not a doctor. I should be clear about that. I'm a courier." He looked at her steadily. "But if I were you, I'd get a second opinion on the source, not just the symptom." He left. Lenora stood in the stairwell for a long time after that. She didn't go back to Dr. Hartley right away. She sat with what Warren had said for nearly 2 weeks, turning it over the way she'd turn over an unusual number in a quarterly report, not dismissing it, not acting on it, just watching it to see if it moved. It moved. She started to notice things she'd stopped noticing. The way the weakness was worst in the morning, not the evening. The specific angle, reaching across her body or lifting her arm above shoulder height, that triggered the drop. The dull ache that lived between her shoulder blade and her spine, the one she'd been attributing to tension for so long she'd stopped attributing it to anything at all. She called Portia and asked her to pull up Warren Cole's delivery record for her building. He was on her route on a Tuesday. She was waiting in the lobby when he arrived. He looked at her with mild surprise and a wariness that she recognized. The wariness of someone who said something honest and isn't sure whether they'll be punished for it. "I'm not going to report you," she said. "I want to ask you something." They sat in the building's lobby seating area, an arrangement of low chairs near the concierge desk that was designed for aesthetics and not conversation, but they made it work. He had 20 minutes before his next stop. "Tell me what you'd look for," she said, "if you were looking." He was careful. He kept saying, "I'm not a doctor," and she kept saying, "I understand that," and eventually they got somewhere real. He explained that in his years doing rehab, he'd seen a pattern with cervical nerve compression that was sometimes misread or misattributed. A structural issue, something mechanical, that created symptoms identical to degenerative nerve disease. The difference was that one was progressive and irreversible, and the other was, in the right hands, treatable. "The key question," he said, "is whether anyone ever ruled out thoracic outlet syndrome with a dynamic assessment, not just imaging, an actual functional assessment." She looked at him. No one used those words. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying that's what it is," he said. "I'm saying that if it hasn't been ruled out, it should be." She asked him his daughter's name. He told her. Phoebe, 7 years old. She liked dinosaurs and hated wearing socks. He said it with the particular fond exasperation of a single parent who has found dinosaur pajamas in every drawer and cannot bring himself to replace them. Lenora smiled. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to. She went to a sports medicine specialist at the University of Toronto. Not someone referred to her through Meridian's network, not someone on the healthcare advisory board. Someone she found herself the way she used to find things herself before she had assistance for everything. The specialist's name was Dr. Amara Nkosi. She was meticulous and unhurried, and she spent 45 minutes on the functional assessment alone. At the end of it, she sat across from Lenora and said, "Has anyone assessed you for thoracic outlet syndrome?" The air in the room felt different then. Dr. Nkosi pulled up the imaging and walked her through it. Not in the brisk, "I have 7 minutes per patient" way Lenora had grown accustomed to, but deliberately, pointing at specific structures, explaining what she was looking at and why it mattered. There was a narrow passage between Lenora's collarbone and first rib, narrower on the left than the right. Significant postural component. Nerve compression, real, structural, mechanically caused, that had been producing symptoms consistent enough with degenerative disease that nobody had looked further. "This is treatable," Dr. Nkosi said. Lenora heard those 2 words and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in 3 years. She didn't know what to call it. It was something like air. "The pharmaceutical protocol you've been on," Dr. Nkosi continued, looking at the file Lenora had brought, "has been managing some of the inflammation, which is why you haven't gotten dramatically worse. But the underlying compression is still there. The medications weren't treating the source." "Who prescribed the protocol?" she asked. Dr. Nkosi said it neutrally. She kept her face very still. Lenora noted that. She filed it away. What Lenora did next was not impulsive. She was not an impulsive person. She spent 3 weeks verifying. She brought in another specialist, a thoracic surgeon at Sunnybrook, who confirmed the assessment independently. She had her legal team pull every document Hartley had submitted to her insurers, every note in her medical file, every treatment justification. What they found was not a smoking gun. It was subtler than that, and in some ways worse. Hartley was a shareholder in 2 pharmaceutical companies whose products were central to Lenora's treatment protocol. The disclosure form he'd had her sign when she became his patient listed general financial interests in the healthcare sector. It did not list specific companies. It was not technically illegal. It was, however, a conflict of interest that he had actively minimized in documentation and in conversation for 2 years. More troubling, Hartley sat on Meridian Capital's Healthcare Advisory Board. He had been recruited to that board 3 years ago by Meridian's own deputy chairman, a man named Jeffrey Strath, who also happened to hold a significant position in one of the same pharmaceutical companies. Strath had been quietly building influence on the board for 4 years. He had never moved overtly. He cultivated allies, raised concerns about leadership stability in closed conversations, framed Lenora's health as a governance question rather than a personal one. He had never once suggested she step down. He hadn't needed to. The structure he'd built was doing that work on its own. The morning Lenora walked into Meridian's boardroom with Dr. Nkosi's assessment, her legal team's findings, and a conflict of interest disclosure that named Hartley and traced his relationship to Strath, the room was very quiet. Strath was seated 3 chairs to her left. He had a particular stillness that she recognized now, the stillness of someone who has calculated odds and finds them acceptable. She had spent a long time preparing for this moment. Not the anger of it, the clarity. She laid the documents on the table and she said, "I'd like to begin with a disclosure." It took months for the full picture to settle into place. The regulatory process was slow and thorough, and nothing like a dramatic confrontation. Hartley's case went to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. Strath's conduct was reviewed by the board's governance committee and, ultimately, by securities regulators who were interested in the pattern of financial relationships he'd assembled. Neither outcome was immediate. Neither was certain in those first weeks. Lenora spent a lot of time on the phone with lawyers in offices that smelled of old carpet and printer toner, and she was patient, because she was always patient when patience was what the situation required. She also started physiotherapy, the first real course of treatment she'd had, manual work, targeted decompression, specific exercises that felt absurd in their simplicity until they didn't. Dr. Nkosi had warned her that recovery from this kind of long-term compression was slow, that the muscles had compensated for so long they'd need to be taught to do things differently. The first morning she woke up and reached for her phone with her left hand without thinking about it. Without the small internal brace she'd developed, the unconscious hesitation before any motion involving that arm. She lay in bed for a long time, looking at the ceiling of her Yorkville penthouse, and didn't move. She thought about the stairwell, the garment bag, the 1 second of focus in a courier's eyes. She called Swiftline. They told her Warren Cole no longer worked for them. He'd left in January to start his own small business, a bike courier operation, local focus. He ran it with one other person and did the books himself. The woman on the phone gave her the number without being asked, because Lenora's voice carried a particular quality when she wanted something. Warren answered on the third ring. He sounded slightly out of breath. In the background, Lenora could hear a child's voice, higher and more insistent than adult conversation, saying something about a sock. "She still hates socks?" Lenora asked. There was a pause. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I've been in physiotherapy for 10 weeks, she said. "I picked up a coffee cup this morning with my left hand." She heard him exhale. It was the sound of someone who'd wondered, quietly, over months, whether they'd overstepped, whether that conversation on the fourth-floor landing had been too much, too strange, too far outside what a courier was supposed to say to a CEO in a stairwell. "That's good," he said. Simple, real, not congratulatory in the performance review way, just, "That's good. I'd like to discuss something with you," she said. "About your business." He was quiet for a moment. Phoebe's voice in the background had moved on to a more philosophical register, something about whether dinosaurs had liked the cold. "I'm pretty small operation," he said carefully. "I know. I read your filing. You're organized well for the size. Your insurance structure is smart." She paused. "And you know things that other people don't, because you came up through a system that taught you to look at the person holding the package, not just the package." He didn't say anything. "I want to offer Meridian Capital's logistics division as your first anchor client," she said. "And I want to talk to you about an advisory role in a health monitoring initiative we're developing, specifically around early identification of compensatory patterns in corporate health programs." She paused again. "That's a long way of saying we look for the thing people have learned to hide." There was a longer silence. She could hear him thinking. "I have Phoebe full-time," he said. "I can't do anything that." "I know. We can structure around that." Another pause. "Why?" he asked. It was a direct question. She appreciated it. "Because you saw something in 30 seconds that 4 specialists missed in 3 years, she said. "And you said it anyway. To someone who had every reason to dismiss you, in a building where you were the least powerful person in the stairwell." She let that sit. "That's not a small thing, Warren." He was quiet for a moment more. In the background, Phoebe had apparently resolved the dinosaur question and moved on to asking whether she could have crackers. "Can I think about it?" he said. "Yes," said Lenora. "Take the week." He called back in 3 days. The crackers were presumably resolved. Phoebe, he mentioned, had recently decided that her favorite dinosaur was the Parasaurolophus because it had a crest on its head like a fancy hat. He said this with the absolute earnestness of a man who has been educated on this subject more than once and has decided to take it seriously. Lenora wrote it down. She didn't know why. She kept a small notebook for things worth remembering. The process that followed was not a movie. It was meetings and contracts and a pilot program that ran for 8 months before it showed any results worth noting. Warren was meticulous and occasionally exasperating and had opinions about operational structure that he'd clearly been storing up for years without an outlet. He was right more often than not. The regulatory outcomes came through in pieces. Hartley's prescribing privileges were suspended pending review. Strath resigned from the board before the governance committee could formally recommend his removal, which was exactly the kind of calculation she'd expected from him. The securities matter took another year. Lenora gave evidence twice. Both times she was precise and unhurried and answered exactly what was asked. The recovery in her arm was slower than she wanted and faster than Dr. Nkosi had projected. By spring, she could shake hands properly again. By autumn, she was swimming 3 mornings a week. Something she hadn't done in 4 years, something she'd told herself she simply didn't have time for, which turned out to have been a kind of lie she'd been telling herself about what she'd lost. One Tuesday morning, she came down through the lobby of her building, elevator working perfectly, no occasion at all, and found herself standing at the fourth floor landing by some navigational mistake. She'd taken the stairs for the exercise. She stood on the landing where a courier had caught a falling garment bag and looked at her arm for exactly 1 second. The truth, she thought, doesn't always arrive with credentials. It doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes it comes up 7 flights of stairs with a coffee thermos and a delivery cart and a daughter who has strong opinions about socks, and it says something honest in a stairwell because it can't help itself, because that's just how some people are built. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the stairwell. Then she walked the rest of the way up.